Hey there, good evening. Tonight's story is not just about history, it's about the kind of past that still breathes in the dark corners of our world. A past where justice was cruel, faith was twisted, and punishment was an art form carved in blood and fear. If you've ever wondered how far humanity can go in the name of order, tonight you're about to find out. If this story can carve even the tiniest mark upon your mind, then before we step into the darkness together, hit that subscribe button, give a like, and tell me in the comments, where in the world are you watching from? It truly means more than you think. Now, dim the lights. Let the last glow of your screen be the only thing standing between you and the shadows of history. Maybe turn on a fan, let its soft hum blur the silence, because where we're going, silence has always meant danger. Tonight, we walk together into a time when life and death played chess across empires, a world where punishment was not just justice, it was spectacle, a world that believed fear could build order and pain could purify the soul. So take a deep breath, for what you're about to hear is not a story of the living, but of those who paid the ultimate price for simply being human. Vestal's burial, the price of purity. Before we begin, let me remind you, this is not just a story about punishment. It's a story about silence, sacrifice, and a faith that demanded something more terrifying than death itself. Now, let the echoes of ancient Rome rise once again. Listen closely. The year was around 500 BC. The heart of Rome beat with discipline, glory, and gods that watched every breath of man. Among the chaos of politics and war, there stood a temple, the Temple of Vesta, keeper of the eternal fire. That fire was not just flame, it was the soul of Rome. If it ever went out, the Romans believed their empire would crumble. And those who protected it were the Vestal virgins, chosen as children, taken from noble families, and sworn to 30 years of service. These young girls were said to be the purest among mortals. They lived apart from society, untouched, untamed, either wife nor mother, but something divine. Their chastity was not a choice, it was an oath sealed by gods themselves. But what if a Vestal broke that oath? What if purity turned into desire, and silence into sin? In Rome, impurity was not forgiven, it was buried. The punishment was known as Vestal's burial alive. A death so cruel that even executioners refused to touch the victim, because the body of a Vestal was considered sacred, untouchable. Killing her directly would be blasphemy. So, Rome found another way. They would let the earth swallow her whole. The ceremony began in absolute silence. No one spoke. No one dared. The condemned Vestal, dressed in pure white, was led through the dark streets of Rome. Behind her, priests walked with torches, their faces pale beneath the flicker of flame. Crowds gathered, but no one cheered. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. As she walked, she carried a small lamp, a symbol of the sacred fire she once guarded. Now, that same flame would light her way to death. At the edge of the city stood the Campus Celeratus, the field of the wicked. There, a small underground chamber awaited her. It contained a bed, a lamp, a loaf of bread, a jar of water, and milk, enough to make the act seem less like murder, and more like burial with mercy. But everyone knew the truth. Once the stone slab was closed, she would never see the sky again. The priest, his voice trembling, would whisper the last words, "May the gods forgive what Rome cannot." Then, as the chanting faded, the earth began to close. Stone after stone, dust upon dust. The muffled cries from within grew faint, and then, silence. The city would hold its breath for 3 days, believing her spirit was carried to the gods. But those who stood near the field at night swore they could still hear her whispers, soft, broken, praying to a heaven that never answered. Why such cruelty, you ask? Because Rome believed purity was power. The Vestals were not just women, they were the beating heart of the empire's morality. If even one of them fell, it meant Rome itself was corrupted. So, to protect the empire, one life had to be sacrificed, slowly, painfully, and publicly. Records say that in over 1,000 years, only a handful of Vestals were buried alive. But each time, it sent a shiver across the empire. Fathers clutched their daughters tighter. Priests burned the sacred fire longer, and the gods, perhaps, looked down with cold indifference. Yet among all these stories, one name still haunts the ruins of Rome: Cornelia, the last recorded Vestal to be buried alive in 90 BC. She was accused of impurity during a time of war and political chaos, but many whispered that she was innocent. A victim of Rome's fear, not her own sin. When the soldiers came for her, she didn't cry. She walked with her head held high, saying, "If I am guilty, may the gods punish me. If I am innocent, may Rome bear the curse of this day." They say thunder rolled across the sky as the last stone fell over her tomb, and within days, a storm hit the city, fierce and relentless. Some said it was coincidence. Others said the gods had taken sides. Centuries have passed, but under the streets of modern Rome, archaeologists have found strange chambers, sealed, silent, untouched. Some believe they were part of those same burials, where the walls still echo with the voices of those sacrificed in the name of purity. So, next time you walk the streets of Rome, remember, beneath your feet once lay the body of a girl who died not for what she did, but for what she symbolized: purity, faith, fear, and the price humanity was willing to pay for them. The fire of Vesta may have gone out long ago, but the ashes of those buried alive still whisper beneath the stones. Death in the sack, pena culiae, a punishment so bizarre, so symbolic, that it seems almost myth, and yet it was terrifyingly real. Now, let's step into ancient Rome, where loyalty was sacred, and betrayal unforgivable. The Romans had a word for everything: justice, honor, blood, and death. But for one crime, there was no mercy, no redemption: patricide, the act of killing one's own father. To the Romans, a father was not just family. He was the foundation of order, the symbol of law, morality, and power. To destroy that bond was to destroy the world itself. And so, Rome created a punishment that reflected the chaos such a crime brought to the universe: the pena culiae, or punishment of the sack. It began in silence. No man who had murdered his father deserved to touch Roman soil again. He was stripped of his citizenship, his name erased from public record. Then, the ceremony began. The condemned was tied, gagged, and dressed in nothing but a thin tunic. Priests stood around him, reciting verses that felt more like curses than prayers. Then, one by one, 4 animals were brought forward, each one chosen for what it represented: a dog, symbol of betrayal; a snake, symbol of eternal deceit; a monkey, symbol of mockery, the animal that imitates man; and finally, a rooster, symbol of false pride and arrogance. Each of these creatures was forced into a single leather sack, along with the man who had killed his father. You can imagine the chaos: claws, teeth, wings, and fear all fighting inside a dark, airless prison of flesh and leather. And then, the sack was sewn shut. For a brief moment, the crowd could hear movement inside: muffled screams, the hiss of a serpent, the flapping of wings. But soon, all sound was drowned by the sound of the Tiber River rushing nearby. Because that was where they took him next. The river, Rome's ancient lifeline, its sacred blood. No murderer of a father could be allowed to pollute the earth with his death. So they threw him into the water, alive, trapped with the beasts, his lungs filling with the same river that carried Rome's soul. The sack would sink slowly, twisting and turning as the animals inside thrashed in panic. No one could see what happened beneath the surface, but everyone knew how it ended. By the time the sack washed up days later, it was silent, swollen, and crawling with flies. Rome called it justice. We, today, might call it madness. But to understand it, you have to understand Rome's obsession with control. They believed every crime disturbed the natural balance of the world, and that balance had to be restored through pain. In their eyes, pena culiae was not just punishment, it was purification. The man who destroyed the symbol of life, his father, had to die surrounded by the symbols of chaos. Yet, what made it more haunting was the ritual precision. Every movement, every word, every animal had meaning. This was not a random act of cruelty, it was theater of divine retribution. And perhaps that's what makes it even more chilling: how humans can turn horror into ceremony, how death can become a symbol, and how faith can justify almost anything. Historians record that the punishment was revived several times, even into the late Empire. In one case, under Emperor Hadrian, a young man who plotted against his father was found guilty. They say he begged to be executed normally, beheaded, crucified, anything but the sack. Hadrian refused. He wanted the example to live forever. Witnesses claimed the man's screams could be heard even as the sack drifted downstream, disappearing beneath the fog. And from that day, the banks of the Tiber were said to be cursed. Fishermen swore they sometimes caught pieces of leather and bone tangled in their nets. The punishment was eventually outlawed as Rome moved toward Christianity. Mercy replaced spectacle, or so they claimed. But the story of Pena Culiae still survived, passed down like a warning, a story whispered to children to remind them of loyalty, obedience, and fear. Imagine that, to love your father was divine. To kill him was to become less than human, trapped, suffocating, dying alongside beasts that mirrored your own sins. Centuries later, when archaeologists uncovered ancient records describing the ritual, even they struggled to believe it was real. But it was, because Rome was not built only on law and architecture, it was built on fear. Fear that if one man defied order, the gods themselves would abandon the empire. And so, they created a punishment that made even the cruelest tremble. A punishment that turned crime into spectacle, and death into a sermon. The brazen bull, the scream of fire. We journey into a punishment so terrifying, so theatrical, that it seems like something straight out of a nightmare, where cruelty was crafted like art, and death had a sound unlike anything you can imagine. The year was around 500 BC, and the city of Rome was alive with power, politics, and an obsession with justice that blurred the line between human and divine. Among the Romans, crime was not just illegal, it was a disruption of cosmic order. And for some crimes, words, blades, or fire alone were insufficient. They needed spectacle. They needed terror. They needed the brazen bull. The brazen bull was a creation of pure horror, a hollow bronze statue shaped like a massive bull, polished to a golden shine. At first glance, it appeared majestic, powerful, awe-inspiring, even regal. But its beauty was a sinister facade. Inside the bull, there was a narrow chamber, barely enough for a grown man. And at the base, a trapdoor, the only way in. And the only way out would be fire. When a criminal or an enemy of the state was sentenced, the act was almost ceremonial. The condemned would be stripped of dignity, dressed in nothing but fear, and led to the bull. The crowd would gather, murmurs rising like the wind before a storm. Priests would chant, soldiers would stand ready. And the emperor, perched on a marble throne, would watch with cold fascination. Once the condemned was inside, the door was sealed. Then, the fire was lit beneath the bull. The bronze began to glow, heating the metal until it burned like the sun itself. The air inside turned to smoke, the temperature soared, and every breath became agony. But here's the twisted genius of the invention. The architects of the bull had installed a series of tubes and pipes. As the victim screamed, the sound was funneled through the bronze like music, transforming their agonized screams into the roaring, furious, indomitable. The crowd would marvel, horrified yet entranced. The condemned screams, muffled and transformed, became an unholy chorus. Every second was drawn out, every gasp, every shriek, every cough for breath magnified by metal and fire. Rome had turned suffering into performance art. The punishment was reserved for traitors, murderers, and anyone deemed too dangerous for a simple death, because execution by sword, by hanging, or even by the arena beasts could not satisfy Rome's appetite for theater. The brazen bull ensured maximum terror, maximum symbolism, maximum humiliation. One of the most infamous victims was Perillos of Athens, the inventor of the bull itself. Legend says he presented his creation to Phalaris, the tyrant of Acragas, boasting of its innovation. Phalaris, cunning and cruel, saw an opportunity, and had Perillos himself become the first victim. As the fire consumed him, Perillos' screams were carried through the bronze, teaching a lesson no words could ever capture. In Rome, betrayal was always punished, and pride had a price. The bull was more than a method of execution, it was psychological warfare. Every citizen who heard the metallic roar knew what awaited those who defied authority. Every visitor to the city remembered the screams that echoed in the night. It was not just punishment, it was propaganda. Terror and religion wrapped into one. And yet, for all its horror, the brazen bull eventually fell out of use. Some emperors feared it too cruel. Others realized it could inspire rebellion instead of obedience. But its legend persisted, whispered along the Mediterranean coast, passed down by travelers, inscribed in chronicles, a symbol of Rome's boundless capacity for human cruelty. Imagine that. A man trapped inside metal, fire licking his skin, smoke burning his lungs, and his screams becoming music for the masses. The outside world celebrated, the emperor smiled, and Rome kept its balance. It is a punishment designed not just to kill, but to immortalize fear. Even today, historians and engineers marvel at the ingenuity and the absolute horror of the brazen bull. It was punishment and theater, cruelty and art, all forged into one. And perhaps that is the true lesson of Rome, that human ingenuity can be used to elevate greatness, or to amplify suffering. Scaphism, the boat of rot and insects, we step into one of the most ghastly and stomach-churning punishments ever conceived by humanity. The crime? Treason, murder, or severe offenses against the state. The sentence? Something so cruel that it defies belief, scaphism. Or as it is more horrifically remembered, the boat of rot and insects. The method was a spectacle of slow, unimaginable torture, designed to strip the condemned of all dignity and humanity while ensuring their torment was as public as it was private. It began with a small boat, often narrow and long enough to hold one person in a confined space. The victim would be forced to sit upright, legs dangling into water, restrained by ropes or wooden bindings, incapable of movement. They were then smothered in milk and honey, inside and out, a sticky, sweet coating meant to attract insects. Food was withheld, leaving only this sweet substance to sustain them. The prisoner was then placed in the sun for hours, day after day. The milk and honey began to ferment, the body slowly decomposing from the outside in. Bees, flies, ants, and other insects were drawn to the scent, landing on skin, in hair, in every crevice. They would burrow, bite, and feast. The human body became a hive, a living feast, while the victim was left powerless to stop it, and it didn't end there. Water lapped against the boat's sides, but it did nothing to cool the flames of the sun or prevent the slow invasion of insects. The combination of heat, decay, and persistent feeding left the prisoner in constant agony, day after day. They could not sleep comfortably, could not scratch without worsening the wounds, and every movement caused unimaginable pain. Food was sometimes given in tiny amounts, only milk and honey, to prolong life, a cruel form of torture masquerading as sustenance. The body weakened gradually, muscles atrophied, skin blistered and rotting, internal organs faltering from infection, dehydration, and exposure. Eventually, maggots and insects devoured flesh, the air thick with the stench of fermentation and decay, yet the victim continued to breathe, aware of each horrifying moment. This punishment was not merely about death, it was psychological warfare. The victim's mind deteriorated as much as their body. Isolation on the boat, the relentless sun, and the invasion of insects created a constant state of terror and helplessness. It was a punishment that obliterated body, mind, and spirit. Witnesses reported that victims would scream, thrash, and beg for release, only to be ignored. The slow rhythm of the punishment created a meditative horror, where the mind wandered between despair, hallucination, and the cruel awareness of approaching death. Ancient writers noted that it could take weeks for a prisoner to die, though sometimes death came faster if infection or dehydration accelerated the process. The final moments were rarely peaceful, the body often so ravaged by insects that it was unrecognizable. The public nature of scaphism ensured that even from a distance, the community witnessed the full moral lesson: defy authority, and you would be consumed by the forces of nature itself. What made scaphism especially horrifying was the combination of natural elements: water, sun, insects, and decay. Unlike crucifixion or execution by sword, which were relatively swift, scaphism leveraged time itself as an instrument of terror. Every hour, every day, became a unit of suffering. The victim's body and mind were forced to experience each moment in excruciating detail, as if the universe itself conspired to prolong their agony. The symbolism was chilling. Milk and honey, symbols of nourishment and life, were turned into agents of decay and death. The insects, often seen as nature's cleaners, became tools of vengeance. The boat, normally a vessel of travel and freedom, became a prison and instrument of demise. Romans were meticulous in recording punishments, and though scaphism is often attributed to the Persians, its terrifying legacy influenced Mediterranean cultures, including Rome's awareness of ceremonial and symbolic executions. It was a reminder that punishment could be more than pain. It could be poetic, horrifying, and enduring, a story to haunt generations. For the condemned, there was no dignity, no mercy, no escape. Even death was not immediate. Instead, it arrived as a slow, unrelenting judgment of every cell, every nerve, every thought. By the end, the body was reduced to a skeleton or near skeleton, skin eaten away, mind broken. A living testament to Rome's understanding of fear. The psychological horror of scaphism remains unmatched in history. Modern criminologists and historians alike are both fascinated and horrified by how ingeniously cruel humans can be. It is the perfect fusion of nature's cruelty and human design, a punishment that leaves no part of the victim untouched. Saw in half, the division of sin. In the shadowed courts of medieval Europe, punishment was not merely about justice. It was about spectacle, fear, and moral demonstration. Among the most horrifying of these punishments was the method known as saw in half, a ritual designed not only to execute but to slowly dissect the sinner, both body and spirit, in a spectacle meant to haunt the memory of anyone who witnessed it. The crime that warranted such an ordeal was often extreme. Treason, murder, heresy, or crimes deemed abhorrent to both God and king. Yet, the executioners of the time were skilled, meticulous, and almost artistic in their cruelty. This was punishment elevated to the level of performance art, where agony was drawn out, prolonged, and made as public as possible. The condemned would be stripped of dignity, bound, and hoisted into position, often upside down to prolong suffering and maximize blood flow to the head, intensifying both pain and psychological terror. Suspended by the ankles or sometimes the wrists, their body would hang exposed to the crowd, trembling in anticipation and fear. At the center of this gruesome ritual was the saw, usually a large, two-handed, crosscut or framed saw. Its edge, razor-sharp, gleamed ominously in the dim light of torches, awaiting the moment when the first stroke would meet human flesh. The positioning of the victim was deliberate. The saw would begin its work at the groin or waist. A method intended to make death slow, inevitable, and excruciatingly drawn out. The crowd, assembled in a mix of horror and fascination, would watch in silence or murmuring whispers, aware that every movement of the blade was a lesson in divine and earthly justice. The sound of metal against bone, the faint, horrific cracking, the victim's gasps for air, all created a symphony of suffering that ensured obedience through terror. Executioners were trained to prolong the experience, applying pressure gradually, measuring each stroke to maximize agony without causing immediate death. Some historical accounts suggest that death could take hours, with the victim slowly losing strength, consciousness wavering, mind oscillating between terror and delirium. It was not merely a physical punishment, it was a psychological torment, forcing the condemned to endure the inevitability of mortality with full awareness. The symbolism behind saw in half was equally deliberate. The division of the body mirrored the division of the soul, a vivid physical metaphor for the sin that had ruptured societal or divine order. By literally splitting the body, the executioners dramatized the destruction wrought by disobedience, heresy, or treachery. The act served as a visual sermon, a stark reminder to the public of the consequences of transgression. Some records note that additional elements were added to enhance suffering. Spices, alcohol, or other substances might be applied to wounds to increase pain. Or the victim might be bound in chains that allowed minimal movement, intensifying every jolt of the saw. The psychological terror was compounded by exposure to the elements. Winter winds, summer heat, rain, or biting cold heightened suffering and ensured that death arrived slowly and agonizingly. Medieval chroniclers often described the victim's reactions: screaming, pleading, writhing, and sometimes falling into a trance-like state as the brain struggled to cope with extended trauma. Witnesses claimed that some victims lived long enough to be aware of their impending death multiple times, a horror that modern minds struggled to fully comprehend. Each moment was amplified, each breath a reminder of the cruel artistry of human punishment. Saw in Half was not limited to any one social class. Nobles, knights, peasants, and accused heretics could all be subjected, though the method and tools sometimes varied depending on status. However, the public message remained consistent. No one, regardless of wealth, power, or rank, could escape the consequences of grave sin or betrayal. The role of the executioner was both feared and revered. These men were skilled in anatomy and mechanics, ensuring that the blade cut precisely and efficiently, prolonging agony while avoiding premature death. It was a grim balance of skill and cruelty, a profession requiring patience, focus, and absolute ruthlessness. Historically, this punishment was rare, reserved for crimes so heinous that lesser methods seemed inadequate. Yet its legacy lingered, whispered in tales across villages, towns, and castles. Children were warned, townsfolk trembled at its mention, and rulers used its memory to enforce social obedience through fear. The method's brilliance, if one can call it that, lay in its combination of physical and psychological torment. Unlike beheadings or hanging, which were swift, Saw in Half ensured that both body and mind were fully aware of each painful second. It was a statement, a warning, and a spectacle all at once. Modern scholars describe it as one of the most terrifying punishments ever devised, noting its unparalleled ability to demonstrate authority while terrifying entire populations. It also underscores a historical reality. Justice in medieval Europe was often intertwined with theatricality and fear, where punishment was as much about the witnesses as the condemned. Imagine being suspended upside down, the world a blur of torchlight and faces, every nerve screaming, knowing that each movement, each stroke of metal, prolongs your agony, and that the crowd is watching, learning, internalizing the lesson. It was not merely a death sentence, it was the embodiment of horror as instruction, a vivid lesson on the power of fear and the human capacity for cruelty. Saw in Half, The Division of Sin, remains a chilling testament to the lengths humans have gone to punish, teach, and terrify. It is a historical echo of terror, a reminder that in some times and places, justice was measured in agony, patience, and theatricality, leaving a legacy that shocks, fascinates, and horrifies in equal measure. Breaking Wheel, the Wheel of Bones, in the grim courts and marketplaces of medieval Europe. Justice was not only served, it was displayed, performed, and feared. Among the most gruesome and excruciating punishments of the time was the breaking wheel, also known as the Wheel of Bones. This was not just execution, it was a slow, torturous spectacle, designed to prolong suffering, instill terror, and turn death into a vivid moral lesson for all who watched. The crimes that warranted the wheel were severe: murder, robbery, treason, and acts considered irredeemably evil. Those condemned were usually brought to a central square or field, where the entire community could bear witness to their fate. Public humiliation was integral. The message was clear. Transgression would not go unnoticed, unpunished, or private. The procedure began with the condemned being stripped of clothing and dignity, leaving them vulnerable under the sun, wind, and rain. Executioners, trained in anatomy and mechanical leverage, would then position the victim beneath a massive wooden wheel, often reinforced with iron, designed both as a weapon and a display platform. The wheel itself was a grim instrument of methodical destruction. The victim's limbs would be spread over its spokes, and with deliberate precision, the executioner would strike each bone in sequence. Arms, legs, and sometimes ribs were shattered one by one using iron rods, hammers, or clubs. Each strike was carefully measured to maximize agony, without causing immediate death, prolonging consciousness and suffering. This punishment was as much about psychological torment as physical destruction. Bound to the wheel, victims could see, hear, and anticipate each strike. The brain's fear response, heightened by helplessness and pain, created a level of terror far beyond the physical blows. Every nerve, Every sinew, every muscle became acutely aware of the impending strikes. Once the limbs were broken, the body was sometimes weaved among the spokes. A grotesque tapestry of fractured bones and contorted flesh. The wheel, now a moving or stationary symbol of agony, was often hoisted atop a pole or left in the sun, so the body would remain on display as a warning. In some accounts, this punishment could extend over hours or even days, depending on the severity of the crime and the discretion of the executioner. The symbolism of the wheel was deliberate and chilling. By shattering the limbs, the punishment represented the complete disintegration of the sinner's power, autonomy, and connection to society. The circular form of the wheel symbolized both the cycle of sin and divine retribution, leaving a visible lesson for anyone who dared defy the law. Witnesses were a crucial part of the process. Families, neighbors, and passers-by would gather to learn, fear, and internalize the moral of the spectacle, the cries of the condemned, the grinding of bone against iron, and the sight of contorted, broken bodies were intended to imprint a deep, visceral understanding of law and order. Interestingly, some historical accounts note variations in the method. In certain regions, the victim would be left alive after their bones were broken, sometimes granted a final mercy strike once they were no longer able to move. In other cases, wheels were placed over rivers or pits, combining water or mud with the physical torment to accelerate suffering while still maintaining the grotesque public display. The wheel was not only about punishment but about demonstrating power and control. Rulers and magistrates used it to enforce obedience, terrorize dissenters, and create an unmistakable hierarchy of authority. It was a stark reminder that justice in the medieval mind was intertwined with fear, spectacle, and education through horror. Executioners themselves were respected and feared. Their skill required not only strength but precision, ensuring that the victim endured maximum suffering while remaining conscious. A poorly executed punishment could fail in its intended lesson, diminishing the impact of the wheel as a tool of societal control. The aftermath of the punishment was equally significant. Bodies left on the wheel were exposed to scavenging animals, weather, and decay, serving as a long-lasting testament to the consequences of crime. This public display of mortality and fragility reinforced societal norms, ensuring that everyone who saw the wheel understood the cost of sin. Medieval chroniclers often emphasized the dual nature of the punishment. It was both deterrent and moral theater. The breaking wheel taught that disobedience, betrayal, and murder had consequences that were both immediate and enduring, that the body and soul were intertwined in the experience of justice. For the condemned, there was no reprieve. The combination of physical trauma, psychological torment, and public exposure created an ordeal unlike any modern punishment. Even brief glances at the execution could instill a deep, abiding fear in spectators, which was precisely the goal. Today, historians view the wheel as one of the most terrifying and systematic methods of execution in medieval Europe. It exemplifies the lengths to which societies have gone to enforce compliance and control through fear. It also serves as a grim reminder that punishment was once a public, theatrical, and ritualized display, meant to engrave morality into the collective consciousness through pain, terror, and spectacle. Imagine being stretched across the spokes, limbs breaking one by one, each strike echoing through the marketplace, every passerby a witness to your suffering, sun burning your skin, blood pooling, nerves screaming, a prolonged, deliberate, and unforgettable horror. The wheel of bones wasn't merely death, it was slow annihilation. A moral lesson rendered in flesh and bone. Impalement. The king's spear of death, in the dark, shadowy corners of medieval Europe and Eastern Europe, justice was not only enforced, it was performed with terrifying precision and flair. Among the most infamous and horrifying of these punishments was impalement, a method so cruel, so theatrical, that it became a hallmark of tyrants and fearsome rulers. One ruler in particular, Vlad the Impaler, also remembered as Dracula, elevated this practice into a signature of terror, a way to ensure obedience, instill fear, and display the absolute power of the throne. Impalement was not quick. It was painful, prolonged, and meticulously calculated to maximize both physical suffering and psychological terror. The condemned, often criminals, rebels, or political enemies, would first be stripped of clothing, their body exposed to the elements, sun, wind, and rain, before the ordeal even began. This initial humiliation was crucial. It was not only about inflicting pain, but about stripping away dignity and instilling fear in witnesses who gathered to watch. The centerpiece of this horror was, of course, the long wooden stake or spear. Carefully sharpened and prepared, it would be placed on the ground, and the executioner would position the victim above it with horrifying precision. Unlike other executions, impalement did not aim for swift death. Instead, the stake was inserted through the lower body, often the rectum or vagina, depending on historical accounts. And the condemned was slowly lowered, their body gradually settling onto the wood. This process could take hours. Death was not immediate. The human body is not designed to endure such concentrated trauma gracefully. Blood flow, nerve compression, and organ damage combined with exposure to heat, cold, and insects to make every second an ordeal. Witnesses, often hundreds of townspeople or soldiers, would observe the descent. The trembling body, the agonizing gasps, and the slow encroachment of death. Psychologically, impalement was brutally effective. The condemned were acutely aware of each moment, each inch of penetration, each shiver, and every passing heartbeat. Their mind oscillated between terror, disbelief, and excruciating pain, a prolonged mental torment as vivid as the physical suffering itself. The spectacle was educational for the masses, reinforcing obedience and instilling awe at the ruler's authority. Vlad the Impaler, notorious for his ruthlessness, would sometimes line forests and roads with hundreds of impaled bodies, creating a terrifying landscape of human suffering. Travelers, merchants, and enemies would pass through these ghastly displays, understanding that defiance or disobedience came at the cost of unimaginable torment. This public visibility was key. Impalement was not only punishment but a warning etched into memory, landscape, and soul. Executioners carried out their grim work with precision and skill. They understood anatomy and leverage, ensuring that the stake entered cleanly and death was inevitable, but prolonged as long as possible. In many cases, victims would remain conscious for hours, their suffering amplified by exposure to sun, dehydration, and the psychological trauma of being suspended above the ground. Historically, impalement served multiple purposes. It was retribution, deterrence, and spectacle, all rolled into one horrifying event. It demonstrated the absolute power of rulers over life and death, the thin line between mercy and brutality, and the terrifying consequences of rebellion. The symbolism of impalement was also clear. By literally piercing and suspending the body, the ruler made a visible statement. The sinner's defiance could not only be crushed but displayed for all to see. The human form, stretched and impaled, became a living metaphor for divine and earthly justice, a warning that would linger in the collective memory for generations. Some accounts describe variations. The stake might be placed beneath the body and the victim lowered slowly, or in some cases, the body was tied to the stake and lifted upright, allowing gravity to do part of the work. Other accounts detail crowds gathered in anticipation, observing, sometimes participating in mockery, adding to the psychological torment. No aspect of the execution was left to chance. Every detail, from the sharpened stake to the positioning of the body, was orchestrated for maximum terror. Impalement was reserved for the most heinous or politically dangerous criminals. But the method's infamy extended far beyond the courts. Stories of Vlad's forests of impaled enemies circulated widely, contributing to legends that would inspire horror tales, folklore, and eventually, Bram Stoker's Dracula. The historical accounts reveal a world where fear and spectacle intertwined. And punishment was both profoundly physical and psychologically manipulative. Witnesses were left with etched memories, the silent screams, the trembling bodies, the grotesque tableau of death slowly unfolding. Even today, historians marvel at the sheer audacity and cruelty of impalement, understanding its effectiveness in enforcing obedience and consolidating power through terror. It was punishment elevated to ritualized spectacle, a deliberate manipulation of both flesh and mind. Imagine being the condemned, aware that every breath, every twitch, every heartbeat stretches your suffering. The sun burns, the wood pierces, insects crawl, the body becomes a stage for pain, the audience a witness to your slow descent into death. And above all, the lesson is inescapable. Defy the ruler, defy the law, and this could be your fate. Impalement, the king's spear of death, remains one of the most terrifyingly memorable punishments in history, a brutal combination of pain, psychology, and spectacle. It teaches us that in some eras, justice was not just about law, it was theatrical, methodical, and designed to imprint fear deeply into society. Flaying alive, the art of skinning. Throughout history, rulers and empires have devised punishments not merely to kill, but to terrify, humiliate, and imprint fear deep into society. Among these, one of the most horrifying, gruesome, and excruciating is flaying alive, the deliberate, systematic removal of a human's skin while they remain conscious. Known as the art of skinning, this punishment is a chilling testament to mankind's capacity for cruelty. Flaying alive was used in civilizations ranging from Babylon and Assyria to medieval Europe. The crime that could earn such a fate varied, from treason, murder, or rebellion, to acts considered sacrilegious or a threat to absolute authority. Unlike other executions that ended in relatively swift death, flaying was designed to prolong agony, ensuring that both the victim and any onlookers would never forget the consequences of defiance. The procedure was horrifyingly methodical. The condemned would first be stripped of clothing, leaving them exposed to the elements, sun, wind, rain, and the judgmental gaze of a crowd. This initial humiliation served to remind both the victim and the spectators of their absolute vulnerability. Every nerve in the victim's body would already be tense, awaiting the unimaginable pain to come. Executioners, experts in anatomy and precision, would prepare razor-sharp knives or specialized tools designed to carefully separate the skin from the muscle, avoiding immediate death while maximizing agony. The process began at extremities, often the arms, legs, or back, and slowly worked toward the torso. Every incision, every tug, every peel elicited screams that pierced the air, a horrific symphony of human suffering. The victim was fully conscious throughout. Pain receptors fired relentlessly, the body, stripped of its natural protective barrier, responded with shock, convulsions, and intense physiological stress. Blood loss was gradual, dehydration inevitable, and the sensory overload of pain. Sound and visual horror created an almost unbearable psychological torment. Spectators were an integral part of the punishment. In public squares, markets, or palace courtyards, hundreds of witnesses would gather, their eyes fixed on the spectacle. They were there not only to see justice done but to internalize the terrifying lesson. The combination of sight, sound, and story ensured that flaying was not just execution, but moral theater, an unforgettable cautionary tale for generations. Flaying alive also had deep symbolic significance. To peel away the skin of a living person was to strip them of identity, humanity, and dignity. The victim's external appearance, which society relied upon to recognize them as an individual, was systematically destroyed. This total physical and symbolic annihilation sent a powerful message. Those who opposed authority, betrayed their ruler, or defied societal norms would be erased in the most intimate and painful manner imaginable. Historical records recount the deliberate cruelty of flaying. Babylonian kings and Assyrian emperors were notorious for using this punishment against captured enemies or traitors. In medieval Europe, rulers occasionally revived the practice to instill terror among rebellious populations or to solidify their authority. The method varied slightly by region, but the intent, prolonged suffering and public humiliation, remained constant. The psychological impact on the victim was as harrowing as the physical torment. Fully conscious, with blood streaming and nerves screaming, the condemned experienced extreme shock, panic, and an overwhelming sense of helplessness. The mind often registered intense horror, regret, and fear, a mental agony that matched, or even surpassed, the physical pain. Flaying alive also carried a performative aspect, similar to other public punishments of the era. Executioners were careful to pace the removal, exaggerate the victim's movements, and maximize the visibility of blood and flesh. Sometimes, rulers would even issue warnings or statements to the crowd as the execution progressed. ensuring that the lesson of obedience and terror was crystal clear to every witness. Despite the gruesome nature of the punishment, flaying alive was highly effective in consolidating power. The visual impact of a person being slowly stripped of their skin while alive left deep psychological scars on any who observed it, creating long-lasting deterrence. Families, neighbors, and communities internalized the punishment, learning that defiance carried consequences beyond imagination. The victims themselves were sometimes coerced into confession before or during the process, adding another layer of cruelty. Each word spoken, each plea or cry, interwove with the physical torment, amplifying the psychological destruction. The executioner's role was not merely mechanical, it was strategic, ensuring that terror was both immediate and enduring. Flaying alive was rarely quick. Depending on the skill of the executioner and the endurance of the victim, death could take hours or even longer, a prolonged spectacle of agony. This ensured that the moral lesson was not only observed but ingrained into the collective consciousness of the community. Today, historians recognize flaying as one of the most horrifying and psychologically manipulative punishments in human history. It demonstrates the extremes of human cruelty, the intersection of justice and spectacle, and the lengths to which societies would go to maintain control and instill fear. Imagine being the condemned, conscious, aware, and helpless as your skin is peeled inch by inch. Each movement a mixture of pain and terror. Blood, sweat, and the inevitability of death become all-consuming, while the crowd watches, records, and reacts, absorbing the lesson of absolute obedience. Every heartbeat becomes a drumbeat of agony, every scream a testament to the terror of punishment. Flaying alive, the art of skinning, was not merely execution. It was a meticulously orchestrated performance of pain, terror, and public lesson, a punishment that combined the physical, psychological, and symbolic dimensions of human suffering into a single, unforgettable act. Boiling alive, the cauldron of suffering, throughout history, rulers have devised punishments that go far beyond simple execution. They were theatrical, terrifying, and meticulously designed to instill fear. Among the most horrifying of these is boiling alive, a punishment so cruel and dramatic that it etched itself into the nightmares of all who heard of it. Known as the cauldron of suffering, this punishment was a fiery, prolonged death, reserved for the most despised criminals, heretics, and traitors. Boiling alive was not quick. Its very nature demanded hours of agony, a slow dance with death that amplified both physical torment and psychological terror. The condemned were often religious dissenters, murderers, or traitors, anyone whose existence threatened the established authority or moral order. To ensure the spectacle's impact, this punishment was usually performed publicly, drawing crowds eager to witness the ultimate enforcement of justice. The process began with the preparation of a giant cauldron, typically filled with water, oil, or sometimes milk. Milk may seem innocuous, but historical accounts suggest it was heated to a scalding temperature, enough to inflict extreme burns and prolong suffering. The cauldron would be placed over a fire, stoked until the liquid reached a near boiling point, and smoke and steam filled the air, creating a sinister, almost ritualistic atmosphere. Before being placed in the cauldron, the condemned were often stripped of clothing, leaving them fully exposed to the public and to the searing heat. This added humiliation intensified the psychological impact, ensuring that the victim was completely vulnerable and powerless. Sometimes chains or ropes were used to secure the body, preventing any attempt at escape and making the victim an immobile spectacle of suffering. When the condemned were finally lowered into the cauldron, the reaction of the human body to scalding liquid created unimaginable pain. Skin blistered and peeled almost immediately, nerve endings screamed with each second. The eyes would water from the steam, and the body would involuntarily convulse from the overwhelming shock of heat and pain. This wasn't just physical torment, it was an assault on every sense simultaneously. The psychological element was equally devastating. Fully conscious, the condemned could feel every inch of skin burning, every muscle tightening in pain, every heartbeat a countdown to death. The screams and thrashing added to the chaos, turning the punishment into a macabre performance for all to witness. Crowds, sometimes numbering in the hundreds, would watch with a mix of horror, fascination, and morbid excitement, learning a lesson in obedience and fear that words alone could never convey. Boiling alive also had a symbolic dimension. Fire has long been associated with divine judgment, purification, and punishment. By subjecting someone to boiling liquid, rulers and authorities literally transformed the human body into an instrument of moral and judicial terror. The slow destruction of flesh was a visible reminder of the consequences of betrayal, heresy, or rebellion. The victim's suffering could last minutes to hours, depending on the method and the liquid used. Oil, for instance, retained heat far longer than water, making death slower and more excruciating. Milk, thick and hot, would cling to the skin, intensifying burns. Sometimes additional elements, such as herbs, spices, or salt, were added to further heighten pain. This was not a punishment of convenience. It was a carefully orchestrated, deliberate spectacle of agony. Historically, boiling alive was employed by rulers across Europe, Asia, and the Middle East. In medieval Europe, it was often reserved for those deemed especially heinous or dangerous, such as poisoners, arsonists, or traitors. Monarchs and emperors used this punishment to solidify power and deter rebellion, knowing that the spectacle of such suffering would echo through villages, towns, and cities long after the execution. Executioners were meticulous in their work. They understood the human body, the effects of heat, and the optimal conditions for prolonging suffering. The condemned were not merely tossed in hastily, they were slowly immersed, sometimes restrained, ensuring the maximum psychological and physical torment. Observers could hear the screams, see the skin blistering and peeling, and feel the oppressive heat emanating from the cauldron, creating a fully immersive horror experience that left no doubt about the ruler's authority. The human body reacts violently to boiling liquid. Muscles contract, the skin swells and blisters, and shock sets in. Breathing becomes shallow, hearts race, and panic dominates the mind. Every instinct screams to escape, to survive, but in this situation, escape is impossible. The punishment is absolute, leaving only horror and agony as the final companions. Boiling alive was also a lesson for witnesses, who were forced to confront the extremity of punishment and the consequences of defiance. Families of criminals, rival factions, or the general populace all internalized the message: challenge authority, and death will not be merciful, it will be excruciating, slow, and unforgettable. Over time, boiling alive became legendary for its cruelty, a symbol of ultimate suffering and a terrifying testament to the lengths rulers would go to enforce law and power. Tales of emperors and kings using cauldrons to punish dissenters circulated widely, feeding folk legends, cautionary tales, and myths that would endure for centuries. Imagine being the condemned. Fully conscious, submerged in liquid at near boiling temperatures, every nerve ablaze, skin blistering, muscles screaming, and yet forced to endure until death arrives. The screams echo, the steam envelopes, and the crowd watches, a silent jury to unimaginable pain. Every heartbeat is agony, every breath a trial, every second a lesson in absolute fear. Boiling alive, the cauldron of suffering, was punishment elevated to performance art, combining physical torment, psychological terror, and public spectacle into a single, horrifying event. It was more than execution, it was a brutal, unforgettable message about the absolute consequences of disobedience. Rat torture, the hungry messenger of death. Throughout the grim corridors of history, human cruelty has often taken forms that are as inventive as they are horrifying. Among these, rat torture stands out as one of the most psychologically and physically terrifying punishments ever devised. Known as the hungry messenger of death, this punishment was a slow, deliberate, and grotesquely effective way to extract terror, agony, and confession. Rat torture was primarily used in Europe during the Middle Ages and early modern periods, although similar methods appeared in parts of Asia and the Middle East. The victims were usually prisoners accused of treason, theft, heresy, or other crimes considered especially heinous. This punishment was not about quick death, it was about prolonged terror, physical torment, and humiliation, designed to make the condemned suffer mentally as much as physically. The procedure itself was ingeniously horrifying. Prisoners would be restrained, typically on a table or in a box, with the rat positioned against their body, most often on the abdomen or chest. The rat was not free to escape. Instead, it was trapped inside a metal or clay container with only the body as its access to freedom. To ensure maximum suffering, the container was then heated with flames, hot coals, or fire, driving the rat to attempt an escape by gnawing through the only barrier, the living flesh of the prisoner. Once the heat forced the rat to attack, the victim experienced pain unlike anything else. The creature's teeth tore into muscle and tissue, creating wounds that were excruciatingly deep and impossible to ignore. Unlike a blade or a blunt instrument, the rat did not provide instant death. It chewed, scratched, and clawed, prolonging agony and forcing the victim into a state of sheer panic and terror. The psychological impact was as terrifying as the physical. Knowing that a living animal was actively devouring your flesh while you remained conscious created a unique, horrifying mental torture. Prisoners would scream, writhe, and beg, but restraints ensured escape was impossible. The combination of helplessness, anticipation, and real-time pain made rat torture one of the most psychologically scarring punishments in human history. Rat torture was also a tool for interrogation and extraction of confessions. Officials realized that fear could be a far more effective motivator than brute force alone. By threatening a prisoner with rat torture, authorities could extract admissions of guilt, details of plots, or information about accomplices, all while ensuring that the punishment itself remained a public demonstration of terror. The method's design was brutally logical. Rats, as scavengers, naturally gnaw and dig when confined and stressed. By controlling the environment, heating the metal or clay housing, restricting movement, and securing the victim, the executioners could ensure that the animal's natural instincts became a weapon. In a twisted way, it was a form of psychological warfare. The prisoner knew that survival depended entirely on enduring the unimaginable. Crowds sometimes witnessed rat torture, particularly when the victim was a traitor or criminal of public interest. The spectacle reinforced societal obedience and demonstrated the absolute power of authority. Watching someone suffer while restrained and gnawed upon created a collective horror, embedding the lesson that rebellion, theft, or heresy would not go unpunished. Families, neighbors, and even passers-by would absorb the consequences without ever participating, ensuring the fear endured well beyond the prison walls. Historians note several recorded cases. In 16th and 17th century Europe, rat torture was used to punish thieves, spies, and alleged witches. Officials often documented these instances in court records, chronicling both the victim's agony and the crowd's reaction. The accounts emphasize not only the physical devastation of the punishment, but also its effectiveness as a deterrent against crime and dissent. The physical consequences were horrifying. As the rat chewed, the skin and muscle tore. Infection was almost inevitable, and the victim often succumbed to shock, blood loss, or secondary complications. The screams of the condemned mixed with the scratching, gnawing, and squealing of the rat, producing a soundscape of chaos and terror that amplified the punishment's impact. What makes rat torture uniquely terrifying, however, is its combination of intellect and instinct. Unlike flaying or boiling alive, which rely on the deliberate action of a human, rat torture turns a living animal's natural behavior into a weapon. The unpredictability of the rat's movements, combined with the conscious suffering of the victim, creates a scenario in which the mind and body are equally assaulted. Rulers and officials recognized that the fear factor extended beyond the immediate moment. Tales of rat torture spread through towns and regions, carried by merchants, travelers, and gossip. Even the mere threat of rat torture could coerce compliance, silence dissent, and consolidate power without a single drop of blood being spilled. The memory of someone being gnawed alive haunted communities for years, achieving psychological domination that outlived the individual punishment. Rat torture also exemplifies the brutal creativity of historical punishments. It was designed not for efficiency, but for maximum suffering and terror. Authorities understood that the fear of the method itself could be as effective as the act. Ensuring obedience, respect, and control over populations that might otherwise resist. Imagine being the condemned, restrained, conscious, and fully aware that a small, terrified, yet ravenous creature is systematically eating into your body. Every nerve ending blazes with pain, every heartbeat is a countdown, and the mind oscillates between disbelief, panic, and dread. Escape is impossible, survival is unimaginable. The rat, merely acting on instinct, becomes a merciless agent of death, a symbol of the total control that rulers held over life and body. Rat torture, the hungry messenger of death, was more than punishment. It was psychological warfare, public theater, and physical torment combined into a single, unforgettable experience. It taught obedience, instilled fear, and ensured that the consequences of disobedience would linger in memory far longer than the bodies of the victims themselves. The Iron Maiden, the embrace of pain. In the annals of human cruelty, few instruments of torture combine psychological terror, physical agony, and sheer theatricality like the infamous Iron Maiden. Known in historical texts as the embrace of pain, this medieval device was both a statement and a sentence, a metal coffin of meticulously calculated torment, designed to make its victim experience the slowest, most excruciating death imaginable. The Iron Maiden, contrary to some romanticized images, was not merely a cage. It was an upright sarcophagus lined with razor-sharp spikes, positioned in such a way that any contact with the body would pierce flesh, puncture organs, and inflict a relentless agony. The spikes were carefully arranged to avoid instant fatality. This was not a tool for quick execution. The goal was to maximize suffering while keeping the victim alive long enough to understand the inevitability of their demise. Imagine being placed inside a structure resembling the silhouette of a human figure. Its exterior was imposing, almost sculptural, designed to intimidate before any action even began. As the doors clanged shut, the victim would feel the first, subtle pricks of the steel spikes against their back, shoulders, and limbs, a cruel reminder that escape was impossible. Panic and anticipation magnified the pain, making the Iron Maiden as much a psychological instrument as a physical one. The victims were often accused criminals, traitors, or those who had incurred the wrath of local rulers. Some were heretics, political opponents, or alleged witches, chosen specifically because their deaths needed to serve as a spectacle of deterrence. Officials understood the terrifying power of anticipation. Before even making contact with the spikes, a condemned prisoner could be paralyzed with dread, imagining every puncture and cut, every moment of slow suffering yet to come. The insertion process was brutal. Victims were usually restrained and carefully lowered into the device. Once inside, the doors were shut with precision, locking the prisoner into a metal tomb. The arrangement of spikes ensured that no body part could rest without being pierced. Arms pressed too tightly, legs bent incorrectly, a shoulder touching the side, all were met with agonizing punctures. Some spikes were strategically longer, designed to impale the chest or abdomen slightly, inflicting continuous internal trauma. The horror of the Iron Maiden was not just physical. The confined space, the inevitable contact with sharp metal, and the realization that death would come slowly, silently, without mercy created an atmosphere of mental torture beyond comprehension. The condemned could hear their own heartbeat, feel every breath shudder against the spikes, and yet could do nothing but wait for the inevitable. Each moment became an eternity of anticipation, fear, and pain. Spectators were sometimes allowed to witness the device before use. Its imposing exterior, often adorned with Gothic motifs or intimidating faces, served to instill fear even before the victim entered. Publicity around the Iron Maiden turned it into a symbol of the absolute power of rulers and enforcers. Tales of its use spread throughout towns, ensuring that mere knowledge of its existence could prevent rebellion, theft, or dissent without a single act being carried out. The craftsmanship of the Iron Maiden was both horrifying and meticulous. Blacksmiths and metalworkers designed each spike with precision, calculating the exact placement to inflict maximum agony without instant death. The interior was custom-shaped to the human form, ensuring that the body could be trapped in perfect alignment with the spikes. In some cases, spikes were even positioned near vital organs, creating slow internal trauma that would intensify over time. Victims sometimes remained alive for hours inside the Iron Maiden. The pain was unrelenting, continuous, and mercilessly systematic. Blood would seep from countless punctures, yet death would not come immediately. The confinement ensured that movement to alleviate pain was impossible, and the fear of further penetration amplified suffering. Every shift of a muscle, every attempt to adjust posture, resulted in new punctures and injuries, turning the coffin into a mechanical predator. The psychological terror extended beyond the victim. Stories of the Iron Maiden's victims circulated widely, becoming tools of propaganda, horror, and obedience. Children, merchants, and travelers heard tales of the device, embedding deep-seated fear of punishment within the population. The Iron Maiden was not just an execution tool, it was a message carved in steel. Disobedience, betrayal, and crime would be met with meticulously crafted, unavoidable suffering. Even among rulers, the device had a reputation. Some monarchs or local governors used it as a demonstration of power, presenting it to citizens, enemies, or visiting dignitaries. The sheer anticipation of using the device could control populations, enforce loyalty, and maintain order. In this sense, the Iron Maiden was as much a political instrument as it was a tool of execution. Victims could not escape its horror. Unlike other methods, there was no momentary relief, no chance for forgiveness or mercy. Its design ensured that every inch of the body touched by the spikes brought pain, and the longer one remained inside, the greater the cumulative suffering. The slow, silent death transformed the Iron Maiden into a metaphor for relentless justice and cruelty, illustrating the extremes to which humans have gone to enforce authority. The Iron Maiden represents one of the most calculating and terrifying forms of punishment in history. It combined engineering, psychology, and unrelenting pain to create a tool that is still remembered for its sheer horror. Its legacy is a chilling reminder that fear can be as powerful a weapon as any sword or spear. To imagine entering the Iron Maiden is to imagine complete helplessness, acute pain, and inevitable death. The device was more than metal, it was a manifestation of control, fear, and precision cruelty, leaving a lasting imprint on both history and the collective imagination of Europe. The Iron Maiden, the embrace of pain, was not just punishment. It was psychological domination, physical torment, and public theater combined, an instrument designed to terrify, humiliate, and ultimately destroy. Lingqi, death by 1,000 cuts. In Imperial China, punishment was a public language of power, a ritualized expression of authority designed to deter, humiliate, and reconcile cosmic order. Among these measures, one of the most horrifying and symbolically loaded was Lingqi, often translated as death by 1,000 cuts. To the accused, Lingqi was not an instantaneous sentence but a prolonged, ritualized dissolution of body and status, engineered to erase a person from memory. The accusations that led to Lingqi were political, moral, or criminal, treason, rebellion, regicide, and offenses that disrupted the emperor's harmony. Those sentenced were visible transgressors whose bodies had to be transformed into instruments of moral pedagogy. The public nature of the sentence made it both legal act and theater. Spectators were meant to learn from the spectacle that obedience, loyalty, and social order mattered. Preparation was exacting. The condemned were paraded, sometimes forced to wear placards describing their crimes, hair disheveled, clothes marked by symbolic stains. They might be processed to marketplaces and temples, a fall from status on public display. In a culture where family and lineage mattered, public degradation compounded the physical torment that would follow. On the day of punishment, a platform was erected. Officials, executioners, and sometimes medical observers took positions. The condemned might be restrained to facilitate methodical removal of flesh in a manner both clinical and ceremonial. The executioner's blade was likely slender and precise, intended to excise tissue without severing vital organs prematurely. The aim was to prolong consciousness while ensuring the ritual remained controlled. Procedures varied across centuries and regions. In some accounts, the condemned received formalized slashes at designated parts of the body. In others, small pieces of flesh were stripped away incrementally, exposing muscle, tendon, and nerve. The executioner worked with repeated, controlled cuts, carving patterns of suffering that ensured prolonged awareness. Each incision produced not only physical agony but a mental collapse as the victim faced incremental erasure. Throughout the ordeal, officials maintained a ritual frame, announcements, ceremonial phrases, and record-keeping ensured the punishment was perceived as lawful duty. Not mere cruelty. Families of the condemned often faced legal penalties too, including loss of property and titles. Lingqi reached beyond the individual. It targeted kinship ties and lineage, aiming to sever the person from ancestral memory. Executioners administered lingqi with an unsettling professionalism. They were trained and often apprenticed in the grim craft. Their role required steadiness and precision, removing flesh under official oversight, inflicting shame and sustained bodily suffering while preserving sufficient life for the ritual to register as formal punishment. Historical records suggest executioners were judged by the effectiveness and ritual correctness of their work. The sensory reality of lingqi was brutal. Blood pooled, skin hung in flaps, and the air filled with the metallic tang of exposed tissue. The condemned screams mixed with murmurs from the crowd, ritual chants, and the administrative voice of clerks recording the act. Suffering oscillated between moments of lucidity and delirium. Physiological shock and fevered hallucination could puncture awareness, yet the body's pain remained constant. Death arrived by cumulative trauma and shock or by eventual severing of vital structures after prolonged mutilation. In practice, the condemned might survive for hours, sometimes longer. The spectacle's duration was an instrument. The longer the ordeal remained visible, the greater its capacity to imprint obedience and fear upon the public. Post-mortem treatment of the remains was deliberate. Sometimes bones were displayed or the body denied proper burial as further humiliation. Historians debate lingqi's frequency and forms. European observers of China often described the practice with horror and moralizing distance, while Chinese records placed it within legal concepts of order and cosmology. Legal codes specified offenses and corresponding corporeal penalties, showing how the body served as both vehicle and canvas for state power. The symbolic potency of lingqi cannot be overstated. It communicated more than pain. It enacted a metaphysics of sin, order, and imperial dominion over flesh and memory. Each removal of skin acted like an inscription upon the body, a legal text declaring transgression, restoring cosmic balance, and demonstrating the limits of human agency before law. In modern perspective, lingqi stands as one of history's most unsettling intersections of law, ritual, and bodily violence. It forces us to confront how societies regulate bodies, how violence is staged to justify power, and how ritualized suffering can be turned into pedagogy. Lingqi is not simply cruelty, it is a mirror reflecting how institutions can harness spectacle to maintain order. Imagine the condemned on the wooden platform, each cut purposeful, each second a measure of state authority, the crowd witnessing a ritual meant to reaffirm hierarchy. In that extreme moment, the body becomes text, the knife a pen, and the state's message is written in flesh and blood. Accounts survive of particular cases that tightened lingqi's fame: high-ranking officials accused of treason, rebels captured after violent uprisings, and sometimes those who struck at imperial kin. These instances became cautionary stories told across provinces. Travelers returned with accounts that blended fact and moralization, amplifying lingqi's deterrent power beyond the city gates. Oral memory and official annals turned individual pain into communal lesson. Markets, tea houses, and family conversations carried the warning onward, and historical reflection persists. The Judas cradle, the seed of sin, among the most nightmarish devices of human cruelty, few evoke as much terror as the Judas cradle, known historically as the seat of sin. This was a punishment so psychologically and physically devastating that it combined public humiliation, protracted pain, and ultimate degradation into a single instrument of terror. Unlike quick executions, the Judas cradle was designed to make the condemned experience every moment of agony, while onlookers absorbed the moral lesson with a mix of fascination and fear. The device itself was deceptively simple yet horrifyingly effective. A sharp, pyramid-shaped wooden spike served as the seat upon which the condemned were placed. The apex of the pyramid was positioned to penetrate the body gradually, ensuring a slow, excruciating ordeal that could last for hours. or even days in the most extreme cases. Executioners and inquisitors understood that the psychological terror of anticipation amplified the physical suffering, making the punishment profoundly brutal. Offenses that warranted the Judas cradle were often sexual in nature, acts deemed immoral or sinful, or crimes that insulted religious or civil authority. Victims ranged from accused adulterers to heretics and rebels whose behavior challenged the social and moral order. This punishment, like many in history, served a dual purpose: to inflict suffering on the offender and to demonstrate absolute control to the community. The public spectacle reinforced social norms and instilled fear in anyone even considering disobedience. Preparation for the punishment was ritualized. The condemned would often be stripped of clothing, sometimes paraded through streets to maximize humiliation. Officials overseeing the punishment would ensure that the victim's dignity was stripped as thoroughly as their clothing, making every movement a visible and agonizing spectacle. The act of placing someone on the Judas cradle was ceremonial, with the spike itself treated as an instrument of both justice and intimidation. Once positioned, the victim's body weight alone began the slow insertion of the pyramid into sensitive regions, producing unrelenting pain. Unlike other instruments of torture, the Judas cradle did not require striking, slicing, or burning. Gravity and the body's own weight became agents of torment. The mind, knowing that each shift, twitch, or small movement intensified the agony, was trapped in a constant state of dread. Executioners sometimes manipulated the device to increase pain or prolong suffering, adjusting the height or angle to maximize insertion and pressure. Victims would be forced to remain upright, often suspended over the spike by ropes or held in place by iron restraints, leaving them helpless against the slow, penetrating torment. Even minimal motion risked deeper pain, creating a continuous cycle of mental and physical torture. The psychological dimension of the Judas cradle was profound. Victims experienced a horrifying fusion of anticipation and reality. Each breath, each movement, each subtle shift in balance amplified pain, leaving the mind exhausted while the body endured persistent injury. The instrument functioned as both executioner and interrogator, extracting suffering without a single blow. Spectators could watch, understand the connection between sin and punishment, and internalize the consequences in visceral, unforgettable terms. Historical accounts emphasize the device's public pedagogical role. Torture and execution in medieval Europe were often intended to educate as much as eliminate. The Judas cradle's victims were displayed so that townsfolk could witness not just physical suffering, but the moral and social consequences of sin. Stories of those punished were passed down, heightening the instrument's fear factor and ensuring that its impact extended far beyond a single platform or town square. The device also carried a symbolic weight. Its pyramid shape, pointed and unyielding, represented the inexorable penetration of sin and the inevitability of justice. Each sharp apex was a reminder of the state's or church's authority, an assertion that moral and civil laws were absolute. By forcing the victim into intimate and degrading pain, the punishment fused physical suffering with social and religious shaming. Medical observations from historical sources reveal that prolonged exposure to the Judas cradle could lead to internal injuries, muscle tears, nerve damage, and systemic shock. Victims might faint repeatedly or enter delirium from the pain. In some cases, the agony would last long enough that death resulted from infection, blood loss, or internal trauma, rather than the immediate physical intrusion. This slow mortality reinforced the psychological terror for both the condemned and onlookers. Executioners and inquisitors were meticulous. The spike's construction had to be precise, the supports stable, and restraints secure. Improper alignment could result in either premature death or diminished theatrical impact. Historical manuals detail measurements, angles, and positioning techniques, illustrating that the Judas cradle was a carefully engineered device of slow death and moral instruction, not merely a crude instrument. In practice, the Judas cradle was rarely fatal instantly. That was by design. Its purpose was to maximally humiliate and gradually annihilate, leaving the victim conscious of their transgression until the final moment. For the community, it served as a symbol of authority and deterrence. ensuring compliance through fear of excruciating, visible punishment. Across European history, the device appears most frequently in records of religious inquisitions, noble courts, and state-sanctioned criminal trials, though its infamy spread widely in folklore. Tales of victims placed on the spike circulated, growing in horror with each retelling. Even hearsay was enough to instill fear, ensuring the Judas cradle's legacy as a psychological as well as a physical instrument of control. Ultimately, the Judas cradle represents the intersection of cruelty, creativity, and social regulation. It transformed human suffering into a pedagogical tool, a public warning, and a form of ritualized terror. Victims were punished, communities were taught, and authority was unmistakably demonstrated. To imagine the experience is to confront a fusion of mental anguish and bodily destruction, where gravity, design, and ritual conspire to make every second a test of endurance. The Judas cradle was not only a tool of pain but a metaphor for the moral consequences of human transgression, an enduring symbol of medieval and early modern punitive philosophy. The Judas cradle, the seat of sin, a device of deliberate, calculated agony, merging public spectacle, private torment, and ritualized justice into one unforgettable, horrifying experience. The pear of anguish, the flower of pain, among the most nightmarish instruments of medieval torture, the pear of anguish, often called the flower of pain, stands as a terrifying example of human cruelty combined with mechanical ingenuity. Unlike swift executions, this device was designed to extract agony slowly, silently, and with surgical precision, turning the body itself into a theater of suffering. Its purpose was not only to punish but to intimidate, to instill fear of law, authority, and moral consequence in both victim and spectator. The pear of anguish was a deceptively simple iron instrument, shaped like a small, segmented pear, hollowed inside and equipped with a screw mechanism. When inserted into the mouth, vagina, or rectum, the screw could be turned to gradually expand the device, stretching tissues, tearing flesh, and inflicting excruciating pain. The gradual expansion ensured that victims could experience every moment of torment, heightening both mental and physical suffering. Its victims were accused of crimes ranging from blasphemy and heresy to sexual misconduct, theft, and political rebellion. What made the pear of anguish especially terrifying was its versatility. Authorities could adapt it for different punishments, choosing the orifice based on the nature of the offense. The moral logic was chilling. The body itself was transformed into the instrument of justice, and the location of insertion symbolically reinforced the crime. Preparation for the pear of anguish was a ritualized affair. Victims were often stripped and displayed publicly, ensuring maximum humiliation. In some cases, officials might parade the condemned through town, placards detailing their offenses affixed to their bodies. This ceremonial procession amplified the psychological terror. The victim knew that every step toward the instrument was a step closer to unimaginable pain. The operation of the device was methodical. Once inserted, the executioner or torturer would begin turning the screw incrementally, forcing the pear to expand inside the victim. Each turn applied pressure to sensitive tissues, stretching them beyond their natural capacity. The mechanical precision of the device meant that the pain could be sustained for hours, prolonging awareness and psychological torment. Victims often cried out or screamed, though the instrument's interior trapped the sounds, creating a suffocating, silent horror that intensified mental anguish. The pear of anguish's physical effects were devastating. Internal tearing, bruising, and hemorrhage were common, and repeated expansion could lead to permanent bodily damage or eventual death from shock and trauma. Yet, unlike devices designed for instant execution, the pear's genius was in its ability to prolong suffering while maintaining the victim's life, reinforcing authority and control. Spectators played a crucial role. The device was often used in public punishments or inquisitorial settings, where the moral lesson was as important as the pain itself. Witnessing the gradual, mechanical destruction of the body served as a deterrent, warning anyone considering similar offenses. Children, townspeople, and officials alike were shown the consequences of defiance, deceit, or sin, embedding fear and obedience in the public consciousness. Historical records suggest that executioners and torturers were trained in the device's operation. They needed precision to avoid premature death while maximizing agony. Turning the screw too fast could kill the victim, undermining the ritual's intended moral and psychological impact. Too slow, and the purpose of public demonstration was diminished. The skill required made the pair of anguish not only a tool of punishment, but also a testament to the craft of cruelty. The pair's symbolic resonance was profound. By inserting it into orifices associated with speech, reproduction, or elimination, authorities reinforced the connection between crime, morality, and bodily violation. The device did not merely punish, it humiliated, desecrated, and terrorized, leaving survivors with lasting physical and psychological scars. Its impact extended beyond the moment of use, entering folklore, cautionary tales, and even the collective imagination of Europe. Medical historians note that the pair of anguish caused severe tissue damage, internal bleeding, and shock, often leading to long-term disability or death. Victims endured hours of helpless agony, aware that every incremental turn brought excruciating pressure, tearing, and near impossible endurance. Its slow, methodical operation made it a uniquely prolonged encounter with suffering, unlike the sudden, sharp horrors of the guillotine or the sword. This device was particularly feared because it combined physical torment with social shame. Being subjected to the pair meant not only intense pain but public humiliation and a permanent mark on the person's reputation. Families suffered alongside victims, as the punishment demonstrated state power over both the individual and their kin, enforcing social hierarchies and obedience through terror. The pair of anguish also functioned as an instrument of interrogation. Victims were often forced to confess under pain, the device's slow expansion leaving them little choice but to comply. Its use highlights the intertwining of punishment and control, where the state's authority was exercised through calculated, methodical cruelty. Unlike random violence, the pair represented ritualized terror, a mechanical law enforced with precision. Blood Eagle, the Viking offering. Among the chilling rituals of Viking lore, one punishment stands out as a gruesome blend of spectacle, sacrifice, and terror: the blood eagle, known in Old Norse as blood orange. Far from a simple execution, this ritual was a methodical, symbolic offering, designed to strike fear into both enemies and the Viking people themselves. Unlike quick killings, the blood eagle was a slow, excruciating death, transforming the condemned into a living monument of punishment. The origins of the blood eagle are rooted in Norse sagas, where warriors, kings, and even traitors could face this terrifying fate, often associated with revenge or divine justice. It was employed against those who had committed egregious acts of treachery, betrayal, or murder, especially within the warrior elite. It wasn't a punishment meted out lightly. To be chosen for the blood eagle meant one's crime was considered beyond human forgiveness, warranting the most horrific form of ritualized death. The procedure itself was macabre in its precision and symbolism. First, the condemned would be strapped face down, often upon a wooden platform or the battlefield itself. The executioner, armed with sharp blades, would begin by cutting along the victim's spine, severing the ribs from the vertebrae with calculated precision. Once separated, the ribs were carefully pulled apart and lifted outward, resembling the wings of an eagle. These wings were meant to mimic the majestic spread of a bird, a terrifyingly poetic form of human sacrifice. Next, the lungs of the victim were pulled from the ribcage, extended outward to complete the eagle imagery. The sight was both horrifying and symbolic. The victim became a living bird of prey, a tribute to the gods, a warning to others, and a display of Viking dominance and vengeance. Blood, sinew, and the natural sounds of agony filled the air, creating a sensory horror unmatched by most medieval European punishments. The psychological impact of the blood eagle was profound. Victims were fully aware of each step, feeling the spinal severance, rib separation, and lung extraction in agonizing real time. Unlike executions designed to minimize suffering, this ritual deliberately prolonged awareness, emphasizing both the punishment and the ritual's symbolic meaning. Those witnessing the act, warriors, villagers, or enemy spies, would be haunted by the sight, instilling obedience, terror, and respect for Viking law and power, symbolism played a critical role in the blood eagle. By transforming the condemned into a winged, bloodied creature, Vikings connected human suffering to divine will. The ritual often followed acts of vengeance for slain family members or fallen allies, turning execution into both justice and a sacrificial offering. The wings of the blood eagle were not merely aesthetic, they were a statement. Betrayal, treachery, and sin carried consequences so severe that even death became a performance of warning. Historians debate the exact prevalence of the blood eagle. Some sagas may have exaggerated or mythologized the practice, while archaeological evidence remains sparse. Yet descriptions in texts like Arkning's saga and Ragnarsona with the QTTR depict a terrifying, deliberate process. Executioners trained in precision, victims immobilized, and the ritual carried out with ceremonial rigor. It was punishment intertwined with theater, morality, and divine homage. The brutality of the blood eagle lies not only in its mechanical destruction of the human body but in its psychological torment. Being strapped, immobilized, and aware of one's own mutilation created a mental anguish beyond physical pain. Victims had no escape, no anesthesia, and no reprieve. Every movement, every pull of muscle and rib, reinforced the inescapable inevitability of death. Its social and political function cannot be overstated. For Viking rulers, the blood eagle was a tool of governance through fear. By publicly demonstrating the consequences of betrayal, treachery, or disloyalty, leaders ensured compliance among warriors and civilians alike. Those considering treason or moral transgression were shown that punishment could be as symbolic as it was lethal, merging law, spectacle, and religion. Cultural interpretations of the blood eagle emphasize its ritualistic and symbolic dimensions. By aligning execution with the imagery of a bird, often associated with freedom, flight, and divine presence, Vikings transformed punishment into a visual and spiritual statement. The condemned's body became a canvas of warning, visible, memorable, and profoundly terrifying. It was justice, artistry, and horror in one act. Medical historians have attempted to reconstruct the procedure, emphasizing the immense skill and strength required. Severing the spine, prying open ribs, and manipulating lungs while keeping the victim alive for extended suffering demanded expertise in anatomy and precision, reinforcing the ritual's status as both punishment and ceremony. Each movement of the executioner was deliberate, maximizing pain while preserving the symbolic wings that defined the blood eagle. The psychological legacy of the blood eagle extends beyond the Viking Age. The act has inspired mythology, literature, and modern media, often exaggerated in depictions of Norse cruelty. Yet at its core, it represents a fundamental truth about ritualized punishment, the fusion of symbolism, terror, and human suffering to enforce law, morality, and social cohesion. It is an early example of how societies used extreme public punishments to maintain order and deter transgression. In essence, the blood eagle is more than a method of execution. It is a testament to the extremes of human ingenuity in inflicting punishment, a ritualized spectacle where justice, fear, and spirituality collide. The condemned was not merely killed, they were transformed into a living symbol of sin, retribution, and the consequences of betrayal, ensuring that the horror endured long after the act itself. The terror, precision, and symbolism of the blood eagle remind us that Viking justice was not merely about death, it was about creating a lasting impression, teaching obedience through extreme, unforgettable suffering. For those who witnessed it, the image of bloodied wings spreading in tribute to gods and vengeance would remain burned into memory forever. Blood eagle, the Viking offering, a ritual of gruesome precision, symbolic terror, and enduring horror, where death was not just a conclusion but a statement to the living, a lesson in loyalty, and a testament to human cruelty elevated to art. Execution by elephant, the king's judgment, across the vast courts and sun-baked plains of ancient and medieval Asia. Rulers discovered a form of punishment that combined raw force, theater, and utter humiliation, execution by elephant. It was not simply killing, it was a deliberate display of sovereign power, an act performed in public to teach an empire a lesson with the most unignorable instrument available, a living mountain of muscle trained to crush. Imagine a royal court where law, legend, and fear meet. The sovereign's authority rested on spectacle as much as statute. When a crime threatened the ruler's stability, rebellion, betrayal, sacrilege, or theft on a politically sensitive scale, ordinary punishments would not suffice. To make an example, a ruler might summon the elephant, the king of beasts on the subcontinent, and turn the animal into an agent of jurisprudence. The ritual was theatrical from the moment the condemned were paraded through the city. Stripped of status and clothing, sometimes adorned with placards describing their crimes, the accused would be marched to a carefully chosen arena, a broad square, a riverbank, or a royal parade ground. Crowds pressed close, merchants, soldiers, women with children, everyone required to witness the moment when mercy became demonstration. Elephants used in executions were not random beasts. They were trained for obedience and trained, chillingly, for violence. Mahouts, handlers who spent their lives with the animals, prepared them with commands, goads, and long-standing habit. The animal could be taught to step precisely, to press a foot until a chest collapsed, to pick a particular victim out of many. This made the execution both controlled and unmistakable. The sovereigns will translate it into measured physical annihilation. There were multiple methods. In some accounts, the elephant stood atop the condemned, stamping and pummeling until the ribcage caved and death came. In others, the animal's trained foot was used to crush limbs and skull gradually, maximizing public suffering while keeping the event orderly. Some kings preferred spectacle. The victim might be tied and placed beneath a howdah, a platform, and the elephant then walked over them. In extreme cases, the creature was taught to use its trunk to lift victims or toss them before trampling, turning brute force into a performative language of dominance. Execution by elephant had symbolic depth. The animal symbolized imperial power, vast, unstoppable, and rooted in the land itself. To see a human body reduced beneath its foot was a lesson written in scale and biology. It said, the state is as inexorable as nature, the ruler's reach is literal and absolute. In a world where divine sanction granted kings legitimacy, the elephant's participation in punishment made obedience feel cosmic. Psychologically, the method targeted both the condemned and the observer. For the condemned, the terror was twofold: facing the animal's weight and realizing they were utterly at the mercy of both man and beast. For witnesses, the display erased ambiguity. There was no private execution, no quiet mercy. Instead, the crowd received a visceral lesson. Transgression would be met by the full force of sovereign will, visible and permanent. Historical chronicles record dramatic instances. In some medieval Indian courts, rebellious governors were led to the field and executed where every local could see. The imagery, an enormous beast pressing down on a human chest while court officials adjusted robes and recorded the spectacle, entered local lore. Poetry and ballads later repeated the tale, ensuring the scene did not fade with the seasons. In Southeast Asia and parts of the Middle East, the practice appeared too, adapted to local customs. Elephants trained to gore with tusks, to toss victims, or to crush underfoot. Wherever it occurred, the result was the same: public terror that reinforced power. There was also a cunning administrative logic. Elephants were expensive, prestigious animals. Using one publicly signaled that the sovereign's resources were boundless, and that those who threatened order could be dealt with by the state's most valued instruments. The executioner's role shifted. It was no longer a single man with an axe or blade but a whole apparatus: mahouts, trumpeters, soldiers, and the animal itself. The state curated the spectacle. The cruelty could be calibrated too. A ruler wanting to terrify without immediate martyrdom might have the elephant wound rather than instantly crush, allowing for a lingering death that compounded fear. Conversely, an instantaneous crushing could serve as a blunt, efficient statement: defy me and you will be ended without grandeur or redemption. Medically, the violence was unsurvivable in most cases. Massive trauma, crushed bones, internal hemorrhage, organ rupture, meant collapse and rapid circulatory failure. Yet this is not to say death was always instantaneous. Sometimes victims gasped and convulsed, giving the crowd further confirmation of the punishment's reality. The aftermath was public as well. bodies left as warnings, buried under disclaimers, or sometimes displayed briefly before removal. The social imprint lasted. As history evolved, the symbolism of elephant executions echoed in literature and travelers' tales. Foreign envoys wrote home of kings who crushed men beneath beasts, and those stories informed both fear and fascination across oceans. To Europeans encountering such rituals, the spectacle seemed exotic and terrifying. To locals, it was a familiar language of power rooted in geography and monarchy. There is a darker legal reflection here, the conversion of an animal's instinct into a tool of state violence. Training an elephant to execute removed the messy personal responsibility from human hands. Kings could claim they did not kill but enforced order through nature. That rhetorical distance mattered politically. When questioned, a ruler could say the elephant acted according to custom and command. The sovereign remained above the blood, inscrutable in authority. In the end, execution by elephant is a study in scale and sovereignty, a method that translated political will into physical annihilation by literalizing state power through nature's force. It is a punishment that harnessed anatomy and theater to project dominance, a ritual that left social memory as much as bodies on the ground. To imagine such a scene is to confront an elemental lesson in authority, a giant animal, a judged human, and a public calculus asserting who holds the right to life. It is an image that lingers, terrifying, immediate, and historically potent, where the king's judgment is not written in ink but stamped in flesh under a colossal, indomitable foot. Execution by elephant, the king's judgment. Judas' cradle, the pyramid of betrayal. In a dim chamber hidden beneath the stone floors of a medieval fortress, a single lantern casts a warm and unsteady glow across ancient walls. Dust floats through the air like drifting memories, settling upon instruments that once shaped the nightmares of an entire age. Among them stands a strange wooden structure, neither chair nor weapon, either throne nor tool. It rises in quiet simplicity, a triangular column carved to a perfect point, balanced on a sturdy frame of polished beams. The Judas cradle waits without sound, its presence steady and unmoving, a silent reminder of a world where pain was shaped with ritual precision. The chamber is cool, carrying the scent of damp stone mixed with the faint sweetness of old wood. Water drips slowly from the vaulted ceiling, producing a soft rhythm against the floor. The echoes are gentle and calm, creating a soundscape that feels as ancient as the room itself. If one listens carefully, the stillness almost seems to breathe, stretching its quiet across the corners of the chamber. Here, history exists not as loud battlefields or roaring crowds but as softness, as shadows, as the unbroken patience of an object crafted to test the limits of the human body. The Judas cradle emerged in a time when punishment was not simply an act but a performance. Law was inseparable from spectacle, morality from humiliation, and judgment from the slow language of suffering. The idea behind this device was not only to cause pain but to shape a symbolic descent, a gradual passing from dignity to surrender. Unlike blades or fire, the cradle depended on nothing more than gravity, the weight of the body, and the stillness of the triangular point beneath. Those who faced it confronted their own physical form, as if their body itself had become the instrument that carried the message of their fate. In this chamber, the condemned would be brought forward in the cold hours before dawn. Their footsteps echoed through long corridors, soft but clear, each step a reminder of how close the end had drawn. Torches lined the hallway, their flames curling upward in quiet spirals. The world outside remained unaware, untouched by the quiet procession of guards leading one solitary figure toward the device waiting in the dark. Whether guilty or innocent, the mind of the condemned often drifted into a strange calm, the kind that rises when the future has only one direction left. When the prisoner arrived, the lantern light revealed the form of the cradle. There was something almost misleading about its appearance. Its wooden frame was smooth, carefully polished, and without any rough edges. The triangular point shone subtly, shaped with precise geometry to ensure a slow descent. It did not threaten in the loud manner of weapons. Instead, it waited with patience. Its power came from the fact that it did not need strength or force. It simply required time. The prisoner was positioned above the device, usually with ropes attached to the wrists and ankles. The ropes were not pulled tight enough to suspend the body entirely, but they offered a measure of support. This allowed the descent to be controlled, guided, and measured. Every movement was slow. Every breath of those in the room synchronized with the gradual lowering of the body. The moment the point made contact with the most vulnerable area of the prisoner, a deep tension filled the chamber. The contact was not sharp enough to slice, but pointed enough to press inward with unbearable certainty. In that moment, the body reacted in countless ways. Muscles tightened instinctively as if searching for an escape. Shoulders stiffened. Breath caught in the throat. The heartbeat became a drum that echoed inside the mind. Yet there was nowhere to pull away, nowhere to retreat, nowhere to turn. The ropes gave only enough resistance to slow the descent, never enough to prevent it. This was the essence of the cradle. It transformed the prisoner's own weight into the slow engine of pain. As minutes turned into hours, a strange and haunting stillness surrounded the scene. The cradle did not scream or clash or burn. It simply continued its patient work. The pressure grew gradually, pressing deeper as the body weakened. Sweat gathered along the skin, glistening in the lantern light. Every muscle trembled with the effort to remain lifted, fighting a force that could never be defeated. Each passing moment reduced strength, inch by inch, breath by breath. The mind of the condemned drifted between moments of clarity and waves of haze. Pain came in pulses, each stronger and slower than the last. Some prisoners whispered prayers, soft enough that only the stones could hear them. Others stared fixedly at the ceiling, eyes wide, as if searching for a final glimpse of something beyond the chamber. The cradle demanded silence in its own way. Suffering unfolded quietly, without the chaos of flame or the trembling of steel. The room itself became part of the ritual. The lantern flickered, painting long shadows along the walls. The sound of dripping water marked the passing of time with gentle precision. Guards stood motionless, their expressions unreadable. The air grew cooler as the night deepened. Everything around the condemned remained calm, as though the world had accepted the slow unraveling of their strength. This contrast between the serenity of the chamber and the agony of the descent created a sense of dreamlike unreality. As hours accumulated, exhaustion overtook the body. The fight to stay lifted weakened until gravity slowly won. The point of the cradle continued its patient journey inward. Pain flattened into a dull pressure, then sharpened again, then softened in waves. The condemned drifted in and out of awareness, suspended between waking and slipping away. It was a surrender not only of the body but of time itself. The world narrowed to the slowness of breath and the stillness of wood beneath them. Some prisoners remained upon the cradle for an entire day. Others lasted longer, their bodies trembling against the final downward pull. The absence of sudden violence gave the device a strange softness when observed from a distance. It appeared almost peaceful, despite its purpose. To those watching, it felt like witnessing a candle slowly burning down, consuming itself inch by inch. The cradle shaped its victims through duration. It was not the initial pressure that caused fear but the realization that it would continue without pause or mercy. Hours melted into one another, blending into a quiet continuum where the body no longer fought, where willpower dissolved, and where the mind surrendered to the slow collapse of the senses. Pain became rhythm. Breath became a fragile thread stretched between moments. The chamber held every sound. The faint trembling breath of the prisoner. The quiet shift of a guard adjusting his stance. The lantern flame moving with the slightest air currents. These gentle notes created a strange lullaby, one woven into the fabric of the ritual. The cradle's cruelty hid beneath the stillness, its horror softened by the calm atmosphere surrounding it. When the condemned finally slipped into unconsciousness, the descent continued without resistance. The ropes held the body upright, allowing gravity to complete its work. There was no sudden moment marking the end. Instead, the passing was slow, almost silent, as though the chamber itself exhaled around them. The lantern continued shining, its small flame steady and warm. The water kept dripping from the ceiling, counting each moment without judgment. The Judas cradle remained in its place long after the prisoner had gone, waiting with the same patience it had held since dawn. It did not change. It did not age. It simply stood as it always had, a wooden pyramid rising from the calm of the chamber, silent and still. Its history endures not because of the noise of violence but because of the quiet in which it was carried out. The cradle belongs to a world where punishment unfolded like a slow ritual, where time itself became the instrument, and where pain arrived not in sudden bursts but in a long, unbroken descent. Through its strange and symbolic design, it became one of the most haunting reminders of how suffering was once shaped with intention. In the soft glow of the lantern, the cradle's wooden surface appears almost gentle. Its smooth edges reflect the light with the faintest gleam. A passerby, unaware of its purpose, might mistake it for a ceremonial structure or a part of some forgotten tradition. Yet its past remains embedded in its shape, carved into the sharp geometry that defined its use. Even now, when the chamber stands silent in memory rather than in stone, the image of the Judas cradle lingers like a soft echo from another age. Its story rests not in screams but in whispers, not in chaos but in the slow rhythm of inevitability. The device reveals the truth about the world that created it, a world where judgment was carried out through patience, where suffering became a measured art, and where time was the silent companion of the condemned. Its legacy drifts through history like a quiet shadow, steady and unhurried. In the imagined chamber, the lantern continues to glow, the water continues to fall, and the cradle continues to stand waiting in the calmness of its wooden stillness. Impalement, the journey of death on a stake. Impalement belongs to that shadowed corner of human history where fear and punishment merged into a single, terrible spectacle. In various kingdoms and empires, from the ancient Near East to the blood-stained chronicles of medieval Europe, rulers discovered that a single method of execution could terrify an entire city into obedience. The practice endured because it was more than a punishment. It was a message carved into the public square, a warning etched into memory. Among the names tied forever to this method, none looms larger than Vlad III of Wallachia, remembered by history as Vlad the Impaler. His reign was not defined solely by cruelty, but by an understanding of psychological warfare. To him, the sight of an impaled body standing rigid against the sky was a political instrument. At its core, impalement was deceptively simple. A tall wooden stake, sharpened and smoothed, was planted firmly in the earth. The condemned was lowered onto its point in a deliberate, controlled manner. The sharpness of the stake varied depending on the desired duration of suffering. When rulers sought a quick end, the stake could be brutally sharp. When they wished to prolong agony, the tip was carved almost blunt, allowing the body to descend slowly under its own weight. This gradual descent might last hours or even days, with the condemned drifting between moments of consciousness as crowds gathered to witness the event. The setting of an execution by impalement was rarely hidden. In most societies that used this punishment, privacy was not the goal. Public squares, city gates, palace courtyards, and battlefield borders became stages for the ritual. The onlookers were not forced to attend, yet many came willingly, driven by a mixture of morbid curiosity and a cultural expectation that witnessing justice was part of civic identity. Vendors sold food, children whispered in fear behind their mothers, and travelers paused on their routes to observe a punishment they might never see again. The condemned, bound and trembling, was fully aware that the spectacle was as much about breaking spirits as it was about ending a life. The preparation itself often began long before the executioner approached with the stake. Prisoners knew what awaited them, and the anticipation frequently became as punishing as the act. There are descriptions in medieval chronicles of prisoners begging for alternative fates, pleading for beheading or hanging instead of the slow journey downward. For many, the terror lay not in the moment of impalement, but in the knowledge of how long it might take. Time became stretched. Every heartbeat sounded louder. Every inhalation felt tighter. Executioners trained specifically for this method were respected by rulers, feared by citizens, and detested by prisoners. Their role demanded precision. A poorly executed impalement risked killing the condemned too quickly and defeating the purpose of the punishment. It was the executioner's responsibility to ensure that the stake was set at the correct height, that the angle caused a slow descent, and that ropes and support beams held the body upright as the ordeal continued. A well-carried-out impalement did not merely end a life. It made an example. Historical accounts describe entire forests of stakes lining roadways during periods of war. When invading armies marched through foreign lands, they often found themselves greeted by rows of impaled prisoners stretching into the distance. These grim forests served as warnings that the ruler they approached was prepared to defend his land with merciless resolve. Soldiers witnessing such scenes felt a chill settle through their bones. The message was unmistakable. Turn back now. The land ahead promises only suffering. Vlad III understood this psychological effect better than most. His reputation, often embellished through legend, allowed him to manipulate fear with remarkable skill. During one conflict, it is said that an invading army turned away not because they lacked strength but because the sight of thousands of impaled bodies made them believe the land itself rejected them. Whether this account is entirely factual or partly symbolic, it reveals how deeply impalement shaped the narrative of power. The slow descent onto the stake transformed the execution into a long performance. The condemned struggled to remain upright, driven by an instinctive desire to hold themselves above the point of the stake. Muscles strained, breath grew ragged, and the body trembled with exhaustion. Eventually, fatigue overcame willpower, and the prisoner could no longer resist gravity. As the body settled downward, the stake pushed deeper, and the onlookers watched in silence or murmured among themselves. The executioner observed carefully, ensuring the ropes remained secure. This combination of physical torment, public humiliation, and drawn-out suffering made impalement distinct from other methods of execution. While the punishment was often lethal, death did not always come swiftly. Some historical reports suggest that prisoners survived for several hours or even longer, depending on the method and the position of the stake. A slight adjustment to the angle or placement could dramatically change the outcome. Executioners who mastered the craft knew how to prolong suffering or shorten it, depending on the ruler's preference. Rulers who employed impalement did not view it simply as brutality. In their eyes, it was a tool to maintain order. In regions plagued by treason, banditry, or rebellion, the certainty of such a terrifying punishment discouraged others from defying authority. The fear of public spectacle, combined with the shame of being displayed before peers and strangers, created a powerful deterrent. The condemned became a symbol. Their fate served as a reminder that the ruler's power was absolute. Over time, the method spread across continents. In the ancient Near East, kings used impalement to punish enemies and intimidate neighboring nations. Assyrian carvings depict captives raised on stakes outside city walls as warnings to those who resisted imperial conquest. In parts of the Ottoman Empire, the method was used during wartime and in cases of grave crime. Even in medieval Europe, regions under intense political conflict adopted impalement to reinforce authority and punish treason. Each culture applied its own variations, sometimes altering the height or angle of the stake. But the core purpose remained unchanged. The social atmosphere surrounding an impalement varied depending on time and place. In some societies, the event became a ritual of justice, accompanied by religious rites or proclamations. Priests might stand nearby, urging the condemned to confess sins or seek forgiveness. In other regions, impalement was strictly secular, devoid of ceremony, its silence broken only by the murmurs of the crowd and the rhythmic footfalls of guards. Regardless of the rituals accompanying it, the central experience remained one of intense psychological drama. The condemned themselves displayed a wide range of reactions. Some faced their fate with resilience, refusing to beg. Others pleaded with desperate voices that echoed across the execution ground. Some cried out for mercy, while others went quiet, retreating into themselves. Countless chroniclers recorded these final moments, not for moral judgment but for documentation. The behavior of the condemned offered insight into the human response to fear, pain, and inevitability. As the body weakened, the mind often drifted into a world of fading sensations. Breathing became shallow. Strength dissolved. The condemned might lose awareness of the crowd, the sky, or the executioner's movements. In these final stages, immobility replaced struggle. The stake stood tall and motionless, a silent witness to the conclusion of a life shaped by political, social, or personal forces. Long after death, the body often remained on the stake. In warm climates, the sun hardened the skin and darkened the figure until it resembled a shadow with no features. Travelers passing through the region paused to observe, whispering stories to one another. Some felt pity. Some felt fear. Others felt fascination. The body, suspended between earth and sky, served as a marker of authority, a reminder that defiance carried consequences far beyond the individual. The landscape of human history is filled with methods of punishment designed to assert control, enforce obedience, and maintain order. Impalement stands out not because it was the most violent, but because it blended physical suffering with psychological impact in a way few other punishments achieved. It demanded attention, commanded respect, and instilled dread. The tallest stakes cast long shadows. For centuries, those shadows stretched across valleys, markets, and kingdoms, shaping stories passed from one generation to the next. Even in distant lands where impalement was never practiced, the mere mention of it carried an unmistakable weight. It symbolized the extreme limits of authority, the point at which punishment became spectacle and justice merged with intimidation. The legacy of impalement endures not only in the chronicles of rulers and wars but in the deeper understanding of how societies once maintained order. By confronting these histories, modern audiences glimpse a world vastly different from their own. A world where rulers believed the sight of a body raised on a wooden stake could hold a nation together. A world where fear was not an accident but a calculated instrument of power. A world where the boundaries of punishment stretched far beyond the reach of imagination. Rat torture, the burrow of death, in the dim corridors of forgotten history, there exists a punishment so unsettling that even the quietest breath seems to hesitate before speaking its name. Rat torture was not created for the quick ending of life. It was crafted for a deeper purpose, a slow excavation of fear, turning the human body into a landscape where survival and terror collided. Across medieval Europe, in isolated dungeons of Asia, and in the shadowy corners of empires where cruelty was shaped into spectacle, this method stood as a reminder of how far the human mind could travel into darkness when vengeance, justice, or domination demanded a display. Imagine a stone chamber lit only by the unsteady glow of a single torch. Its flame moves gently, casting shadows that sway across the walls like silent observers. The air is heavy, carrying the faint scent of rusted chains, damp earth, and the cold memory of countless voices that once echoed here. In the center of this space sits a wooden table, its surface scarred by years of restraint. Above it hangs a set of iron rings, worn smooth from the friction of ropes and trembling hands. This is where the condemned is brought. Not with haste, but with a deliberate calm that intensifies the weight of the moment. Their footsteps shuffle across the floor, and each sound seems louder in the quiet. There is no need for shouting. The punishment speaks for itself. The eyes of the executioners reveal nothing, for they have seen this ritual unfold many times. In their expressions lies a cold familiarity, as though they are guiding the condemned into a process already older than their own lives. The person is placed on the table, wrists bound, ankles secured, breath trembling beneath ribs that rise and fall with growing panic. The mind tries to search for hope, for escape, for any corner of reason that might soften the reality ahead. Yet the chamber offers no comfort. It is built for silence, built for endurance, built for a demonstration of absolute control. The fear does not come from the violence of blades or the weight of iron. It comes from anticipation, from the slow understanding that one small creature can alter the entire destiny of a human body. The instrument of punishment is a simple metal container, shaped like a pot or a small bucket. It looks harmless, almost ordinary. But the executioners bring it forward with the same reverence one might show a sacred object. Inside the metal vessel, claws scratch against the walls. A faint squeak, an impatient rustling, a restless movement announces the presence of the creature chosen to administer the suffering. The rat is not trained. It does not need to be. Instinct alone is enough. Rats were selected because they are survivors by nature. Intelligent, adaptable, and driven by an unending need to escape danger. They will chew through wood, soil, or flesh if pressed to do so. In the hands of those who designed this punishment, these qualities became tools. The rat becomes both executioner and victim, desperately seeking a way out of the heat that will soon surround it. The pot is placed on the abdomen or the chest of the condemned. Its rim is pressed firmly against the skin so no space remains for escape. The cold metal sends a shiver through the body beneath it. The executioners then secure the pot with straps that wrap around the torso, tightening until movement becomes nearly impossible. The condemned feels the weight of the vessel and the subtle motion inside as the rat searches for an exit. The heartbeat quickens. The skin grows warm. Sweat forms along the temples. A metal plate is placed on top of the pot, sealing the rat inside. This enclosure is not yet dangerous. The true agony begins only when the executioners bring a heated piece of iron or glowing coal near the outer surface of the pot. They do not touch it directly at first. The rising warmth alone is enough to stir panic in the confined creature. The rat begins to move faster, claws scraping against metal with increasing urgency. The condemned feels everything. The vibrations, the shifting weight, the frantic attempts of the rat trying to escape the growing heat. The executioners bring the heat source closer, raising the temperature of the metal. The pot becomes warm, then hot, then unbearable for the rat trapped inside. Its survival instinct takes over. There is only one direction left to flee, only one surface cooler than the burning metal, the soft flesh beneath it. With no other choice, the rat begins to dig. The first touch of claws against human skin is sharp, but not immediately agony. It is the knowledge of what follows that tightens every muscle. The rat pushes, scratches, and finally breaks through the skin. A jolt of pain shoots through the body on the table. Breath catches in the throat. The body arches involuntarily, yet the restraints hold firm. There is nowhere to go. Slowly, methodically, the rat continues. Its claws open the wound further, and its teeth, sharp and efficient, begin carving a tunnel through muscle and tissue. Every movement is a mixture of instinct and desperation as it searches for an escape route. The condemned feels every motion. Each bite becomes a pulse of fire radiating outward. The pain is not clean or quick. It is layered, unfolding gradually, like a storm gathering strength. The executioners watch in silence. Their role now is only to maintain the heat, ensuring the rat remains motivated to dig deeper. The chamber becomes a place where time stretches, where minutes feel like hours. Pain transforms into a constant tide, rising and falling with each movement inside the body. There is no rhythm to it. No pattern the mind can predict. The rat follows only its own sense of urgency. As the creature tunnels further, it encounters the warmth of blood and the softness of organs. The sensation within the body changes. Pain becomes pressure. Pressure becomes shock. The condemned struggles to breathe as the body works against itself to survive. Yet the rat continues, driven by instinct alone. In many accounts, the creature eventually emerges deeper within the torso, burrowing in search of freedom in a direction determined only by heat and terror. Throughout the process, the condemned remains painfully aware. The body is alive long enough to feel the full journey of the rat. The mind drifts between panic and a strange clarity. The faint crackle of the heat above, the quiet motions inside the pot, and the movements within the body create a soundscape that lingers in the chamber like an eerie symphony. The executioners do not speak. They wait, observing the slow collapse of the person before them. The rat eventually reaches a place within the body where the warmth of blood and the cooling flesh provide some relief from the heated metal above. Yet its presence inside the torso only deepens the suffering. The condemned endures the unnatural feeling of movement beneath the skin. An invasion unlike any other. The pain becomes an all-encompassing force, overwhelming the senses until the boundaries between body and torture blur. In some instances, the process lasted hours. In others, it stretched into the night. When the body could no longer endure, breath faded and consciousness dissolved into stillness. The chamber returned to silence. The heat source was removed. The pot, now cooled, was lifted away. The rat emerged, stained and trembling, seeking the shadows. It had survived, but the person beneath it had not. Rat torture remains one of history's most disturbing methods, not for its spectacle but for its intimacy. The body becomes the battleground. The creature acts as a living instrument of terror. The punishment reveals not only the extremes of human imagination but also the depths to which power will go to shape fear. In the quiet that follows, the chamber holds the memory of the suffering. The torch flickers. The air grows still. And the echoes of what happened linger long after the final breath has faded.